Mick Taylor, Why Talent Alone Fails, Part 2. Problems with the album. There's something appealing about musicians who are focused on the music itself, who are not prioritizing a career, so to speak, as a star musician. There's a purity to the whole endeavor of making music for them. This is the path Mick Taylor would eventually strike out on. But first, he tried to be an effective singer-songwriter who produced his own work. Notably, he didn't attempt to be an interpreter of others' material, which had been one of his great strengths. I always felt that was a mistake. When, for example, Brian Ferry of Roxy Music successfully built a solo career interpreting older material from the mid-70s onwards. Taylor wasn't a guy who kind of thought, I want to be Mick Jagger, or I want to be Bob Dylan. He wasn't laser focused on being savvy, like I must get songwriting credits, I must always write my own shit, I must build my profile relentlessly as a composer-writer. In the late 70s, we'll see that Elvis Costello would kind of inhabit that vibe. Taylor said he started composing in about 1976 on piano. He clearly wasn't prolific, but some of the pieces were high-quality work. It strikes me that working with a collaborator over some time would have helped him maybe compose 5 pieces of great artistic standard. We don't know if he tried this route. We can only speculate that the original sin during Taylor's time in the Stones was the denial of songwriting credits for those high-quality pieces he did contribute to. Later, when he tried to establish himself as a solo artist, he would have had far more credibility and been able to attract high-caliber collaborators and more resources. Without this, the project was an uphill struggle. As it was, he had to work as a session musician while trying to record the album. This led to a fragmented recording process which undoubtedly hindered the vision of the work. It was recorded in a stop-start fashion, taking 3 years to complete in various facilities across southern Britain, which included Basing Street Studios, the very one he had been ejected from by Jagger a few years earlier. When it was finally finished, Columbia told Taylor it wouldn't provide any resources for him to tour, and the record had to succeed through radio airplay alone. This was effectively a death sentence for an unknown artist. Frustrated by this lack of support, Taylor took a break from the music industry for approximately 1 year. There are many outside factors then that affected his solo release and the fate it encountered. That leaves the question, apart from all that, is it any good at all? Mick Taylor by Mick Taylor, 1979. I've said repeatedly that Taylor could have produced a very good debut album to launch his solo career. I've done as much coulda, shoulda, woulda as anyone else when I wanted a favourite artist to knock it out of the park, when they actually didn't. So here I go. I'm going to dive into the what could have beens on this one. Here's what I believe might have been done to change the outcome. If you think differently, let me know. When I listen to it, I enjoy it, especially the songs Alabama, Slow Blues, Baby I Want You, and Spanish A minor. Altogether, I've always preferred it over Mick Jagger's solo efforts, most of Keith's, and I find it's on a par with Bill Wyman's Monkey Grip. And yet, my problem with it are songs like Leather Jacket, A Stone's Cast Off, Broken Hands, SW5 and Giddy Up, which really date it. What the album really suffers from is a lack of a cohesive theme or story that ties together Taylor as an artist and the album as a personal musical statement, a brand or artistic vision. The examples we look at below all have some of this and other qualities Taylor lacked as well. It should have been a great debut solo album, Taylor stepping into the limelight created by being the Stones' lead guitarist at a peak point, after all. But sadly, he didn't manage to grasp the opportunity musically. A natural comparison is the Stones' Some Girls. As an album, it's a bit ragged at times, a little bit overly slick in some places, and a tad cynical in others. But it has a story, courtesy of Keith's drug bust in Canada, and it has heart and guts, thanks to Beast of Burden, Miss You, Respectable, and Shattered. Pub rock, absurdity, and horror. There are more comparisons to draw from the late 70s, when much was fermenting and blues-based music had not yet fallen completely out of style. The album Dire Straits, with a similar level of musicianship, shows what might have been. Taylor's album cover is even reminiscent of the Straits' self-titled debut sleeve. Mark Knopfler, the composer, lead guitarist and bandleader of the London-based group, is comparable to Mick Taylor. 7 months younger than Taylor, he too had parents who supported his musical path, and he too had early unsuccessful experiences forming bands. That's where the comparisons end. Taylor had a gilded path into the upper levels of the British blues scene with John Mayall while Knopfler scratched around working as a music journalist and a teacher, playing pub gigs with his brother David until the late 70s. Borrowing £500 or $670 at the time, the equivalent of £3,000 in today's money, to record a 5-song demo, Knopfler sent a copy of Sultans of Swing to local DJ and rock historian Charlie Gillett, who played it on his radio show and alerted a record label talent scam. Just like that, the newly formed Dire Straits were signed to Phonogram Records. Before the band released their debut album, they were booked on a 23-day tour of the UK supporting Talking Heads at the end of 1977. Having created a buzz with their skillful playing, 2 months later they recorded the album at a cost of £12,000, about £70,000 today, at Island Records Basing Street Studios with Steve Winwood's brother Muff. It was released in October 1978 while Mick Taylor was recording his album. It sold 8 million copies in 9 months. It contains tracks that are blues and country-tinged rockabilly, with some acknowledgements to modern musical styles such as reggae and adult-oriented rock. Knopfler's songs were characterised by the intricacies of his guitar playing, the rolling gait of the band's rhythms. The story of the album was in many ways Mark Knopfler's own, from his growing up in Newcastle to his move down to London and his struggles in starting a musical career. The stories, and even the name of the band, Dire Straits, connected with a wide audience across Britain, Europe and America. Music buys who enjoyed a higher level of musicianship than punk provided flocked to buy the album off the hit single's radio airplay and the attention created by the band's tour the previous year. That big hit, Sultans of Swing, was based on Knopfler's experience of watching a down-at-heel jazz band in a bar in South London with the grand name he used as the song's title. Dire Straits provided musical credibility with a compelling narrative that suited the times. The last 3 tracks are jam-style songs similar in tone and feel to Taylor's album, especially its closer Spanish A minor. Dire Straits' closer Lions is especially reminiscent of Taylor's work, while the track Giddy Up on Mick Taylor could easily have felt at home on the Dire Straits album. Musicians immediately took notice of Dire Straits, and Bob Dylan invited Mark Knopfler to collaborate on songs for his new album 1979's Slow Train Coming while the band toured the US. The next steps in Mark Knopfler's journey are instructive of how the two men's fate diverged and how Knopfler's collaborators made a key difference. After a successful follow-up album, Communique was recorded in 1979, with legendary Atlantic producer Jerry Wexler. Dire Straits was set to record with up-and-coming producer Jimmy Iovine. However, tensions were high, especially between brothers Mark and David. Iovine took Mark to watch Bruce Springsteen recording with the E Street Band. Knopfler was shocked and amazed, as his brother tells it. Everyone was calling Springsteen boss, and he completely called the shots. But Bruce had spent 30 years learning to be the boss, and he's very good at it. Mark had not long come from being a college lecturer and hadn't been schooled in people skills. The instructional trip led to David Knopfler's ousting from the band, leaving Mark as the undisputed king of Dire Straits. By 1980, Knopfler had completed the journey Mick Taylor had never quite made, albeit under different circumstances. Back in 1977, Elvis Costello emerged with a broader range and a younger freewheeling style than Taylor's, and an album full of hooks. Blame It on Kane, from his debut album My Aim Is True, is classic blues, with a quintessentially English twist, and couldn't be any closer to Mick Taylor's style. But for Costello, everything else was put into place to give him mass appeal. The trick that turned Declan McManus into Elvis Costello was cooked up by his independent label, Stiff Records. The look, a cross between early Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, was contrived to make the geeky singer look as awkward a customer as possible, in keeping with the punk vibe of the late 70s. The former computer operator was even arrested outside of Columbia Records in a stunt that succeeded in attracting the attention of the major label, which had passed on the singer's earlier demos. With a spiky new image and a batch of aggressive, masochistic love songs with renegade generational values, CBS were finally willing to give Costello a chance. On My Aim Is True, Costello staked a claim as the grandpappy of incel culture on songs like I'm Not Angry and Miracle Man. He said of both songs, as far as I can see, those are the only songs in the rock idiom where a guy is admitting absolute defeat. Modestly put by the bespectacled self-promoter, except if I'm not wrong, Buddy Holly had beaten him to the punch by about 20 years on learning the game, and Lennon had staked a claim with Jealous Guy. But Elvis would not be put off his claim. No, I'm talking about being a complete loser. That's totally new to the rock idiom. Okay, we get it. Elvis Costello was certainly brash about the image he was going for, even if it never clicked for me. His incessant need to mew out as many words as the breaths he takes makes Costello good copy. In an interview with Nick Kent, he explained his process. The only motivating points for me writing songs are revenge and guilt. What stands out apart from the quality of his songwriting is that Stiff Records and Costello made being a geek into a brand. He was smart enough to go along with the part because, as he said at the time, I knew there was only one chance to get my foot in the door. I tailored my songs because I knew which way the wind of prevailing trends was blowing, and that it would also steamroller anyone who happened to be going against it. Words maybe Taylor should have paid attention to. Having had a good start at Columbia as Mick Taylor's label mate, Costello soon found himself out of favour, a situation which he could not fail to comment on. The simple fact is that anyone with any talent at Columbia was never given a chance. People would suddenly become invisible. Perhaps he was right, and perhaps this is what contributed to Mick Taylor's woes. Returning to the music, a broader comparison to Taylor is Bryan Ferry, who took an old R&B blues song, Let's Stick Together, into the UK top 10 in 1976. Ferry arrived with a fully formed artistic concept. He had studied fine art and understood visual culture. Once he decided to be a musician, Ferry collaborated with best fashion designers in London to construct an image before he constructed his music career. His album cover art for 1976, Let's Stick Together, made him look like a fashion model or a movie star. Although famous designers Hypnosis did both the covers for Mick Taylor and Dire Straits, it's clear from Bryan Ferry's cover that he is extra conscious of how the music ties into his image as an artist. As for the music itself, Ferry showcased the possibilities of how Taylor could have strengthened his record. There's a Jimmy Reed cover, Shame, 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 which was bread and butter for Taylor after his stint with the Stones. The Roxy Music frontman also honours the Beatles with the cover of It's Only Love, a band that teenage Taylor had a lot more affection for than his eventual employers, the Stones. We have seen how shock tactics worked for the Sex Pistols and how real-life drama like Keith Richards' arrest for heroin possession worked to pierce the public consciousness. In a more subtle way, Mark Knopfler was able to use his life story as the canvas for Dire Straits' debut. Mick Taylor could also have used his own biography and life experiences to inject his songs with a narrative or coherent artistic vision. However, Taylor the man and the artist clearly weren't built that way. Anyone familiar with the story of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen sad end and Nick Kent's disquieting retelling of it in print is reminded that in this life, horror is only around the corner. Mick Taylor never mined this aspect of life, never drew from his struggles with addiction. That would have given the album character. It's surprising since Taylor had played in a band that constantly provided warnings about how quickly happy times could turn dark and uncontrollable. With all these possibilities, it feels that Taylor didn't quite grasp what he had to do with his first album if he wanted to establish himself as a solo artist. With his interest in Brazilian music, country, prog rock, jazz and blues, it seems inconceivable that an alternative album could not have been possible. He could have been true to his blues roots and still presented the music in a more contemporary way, and leaned far more into his strengths. I would have loved to hear him have a go at a country track, for example, because he was always so good at playing those with the Stones. Was he oversteered by Columbia to make an album that would have more popular appeal without relying on his time-tested skills? I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case, because the finished album reflects his inexperience in handling this kind of project, but more so, a lack of strong collaborators. Not only newcomers like Knopfler, Costello or Ferry who grabbed the support they were offered, but 60s heavyweights George Harrison and Eric Clapton had a slew of key collaborators to help them make the transition from their bands to become band leaders and successful solo artists in the 70s. In truth, Mick Taylor the album, of course, reflects Mick Taylor the man and the artist. For most of his life, his guitar has spoken commandingly and lyrically for him. He seems as hard to know from this work as Keith Richards has suggested he is. The hypothetical albums I can conjure up that Mick Taylor could have made were probably no more realisable than the possibility of him remaining in the Stones after 1974 and still be playing the Stones' War Horses on stadium tours to this day. It's the curse and joy of being a fan. The might-have-beens are tantalising in the absence of a happy ending. After 79. In the early 80s, Taylor found a route back to music making with the help of his old pals, the Stones and the Bluesbreakers. Apart from his live appearance with the Rolling Stones in 1981, he toured with the Bluesbreakers in 82 and 83 and again in the late 90s. He also worked with new collaborators, starting with Alvin Lee and his band on their 1981 American tour. Taylor's guitar skills are showcased magnificently on Lee's material, and it's worth listening to the recordings on YouTube. At the end of the Bluesbreakers tour in 1983, Bob Dylan met Taylor in LA, and they worked together with Mark Knopfler on Dylan's album Infidels, the follow-up tour, captured on the album Real Live, released in 1984, and the following year's studio album Empire Burlesque. On Dylan's 1984 European tour, Taylor had the opportunity to play with one of his influences, Carlos Santana, alongside Joan Baez. On a personal note, my wife saw Dylan and Taylor on this tour. Many years later, as I burbled excitedly that she had witnessed one of the greatest guitarists of the rock era, she said, "Who's Mick Taylor?" Ouch! The late 80s found him working as a session musician playing lead guitar on Joan Jett and the Blackhearts' top 10 hit, I Hate Myself for Loving You. Somewhere along the way, he hooked up for sessions with Hollywood Rose, Axl Rose's glam rock precursor to Guns N' Roses. Slash has described Taylor as his biggest influence. And then, in the early 90s, Taylor put together his own band and started touring as a solo artist, and releasing several well-regarded albums such as 1990's Stranger in This Town. This is another one of his albums that I thoroughly enjoy, especially his reworking of Jumping Jack Flash, Little Red Rooster, and Jimi Hendrix's Red House. Even more interestingly, he hooked up with Carla Olson and released a couple of live albums, including 1991's Too Hot for Snakes, that contains some of his most lyrically blistering fretball work. Their interpretations of the Stones' Sway and Winter surpassed the originals. That same year, Taylor contributed to American alt-rock band Dramarama's album Vinyl, which I recommend listening to hear the guitarist's work in a different setting. In later years, Mick Taylor reunited with many of the past Bluesbreakers, including Eric Clapton, for John Mayall's 70th birthday concert in 2003. The circle was completed in 2014 and 2015 when Taylor joined the Rolling Stones on their 50 and Counting and On Fire tours. As he had predicted as a young boy, he was always in demand for his guitar skills, and he got to play with many seminal rock artists and a host of independent rock bands. What's not to like, you may ask? Until the next time. But for us fans, Taylor's story has a sense of unfairness. There's no resolution to it. It's another legend of the type of life musicians lead. In a way, Mick Taylor didn't have the big career that he could have had, but it's likely he really didn't want it. All the things he didn't lean to after leaving one of the biggest rock bands ever point to this. The whole branding, image, selling yourself, career mapping thing was not for him. But his quote, "I had a feeling I'd be a successful guitarist," tells us that in the end, he was successful because he spent his life working in music and being a guitarist, and he played with a lot of very incredibly exciting leading bands. And so maybe ultimately he didn't want something else, or not badly enough. Oh yeah, can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might find that you get what you need. That was Mick Taylor, Why Talent Alone Fails, by ROLLOGUITAR, published by RJ Tosher on Patreon.